Throughout recorded history, walls and other barriers have served a single function: to divide, to separate. This is true whether walls are built to keep people out or to keep them imprisoned. The wall being constructed on the West Bank by the Israeli government is no different. 25 feet high, studded with guard towers and armaments, and encrusted with high-tech sensors, the wall cuts across the land, separating Palestinians from their own farms, their own neighbors, and from the Israeli settlements which have sprung up rapidly as a result of lavish subsidies from the Israeli government. In November of 2003, Professor James Rauch of the University of California, San Diego, explained how the political climate in Israel led to the building of the wall.
The Israeli public has been clamoring for a separation wall between Israel and the West Bank for some time. The reason is that there is a wall now, or at least a fence, between Israel and the Gaza Strip, and that is generally credited with keeping out terrorists in the Gaza Strip from infiltrating Israel proper. So the idea in most people's minds was, let's build a fence or separation wall along the 1967 boundary between Israel and the West Bank, and this will also keep terrorists from the West Bank out of Israel, much as the barrier between the West Bank, the barrier between Israel and the Gaza Strip has kept people out of Israel. As things have turned out, the wall hasn't been built along the 1967 boundary. Rather, the wall has been built along the boundaries for the Palestinian state that were proposed in the Camp David agreements. Not exactly, but very roughly along those boundaries. So it's been built entirely on the Palestinian side of the 67 border, which has meant confiscation of Palestinian land, and in some places, in particular to take in the settlement of Ariel, the wall has cut very deeply into the Palestinian territories. There is also an eastern section of the wall being proposed and partly started, which will cut off the Palestinian cities from the Jordan Valley region, and that will implement the part of the Camp David Accords which stated that the Jordan Valley region was going to remain under indefinite Israeli military control. So in effect, the wall would unilaterally implement the Camp David proposals back from 2000.
The territories occupied by Israel have become a symbol of the new frontier for Zionist settlers. From around the world, settlers come to Israel, seeking to expand the state, inch by inch, dunham by dunham, which is a local measure of land area equal to 1,000 square meters. Enticed by grants of $15,000 per settler, specially reduced tax rates, business subsidies, and a network of bypass roads that lead directly to the new settlements and are forbidden to Palestinians, the Israeli settlers have succeeded in confiscating 55% of the land occupied by Israel in the Six-Day War, with most of this expansion taking place since the 1980s. Professor Rauch described how the rate of Israeli settlement increased since the time of the Y Accords in 1998, and how it continued to grow through the period of the Camp David negotiations in 2000. He also explained how these settlements affect the local Palestinians.
In 1998, with the signing of the Y Accords, W-Y-E, Y Accords, these settlements were increased or accelerated by Ehud Barak, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, from 9,000 to 12,000 per year to 15,000 per year. And the idea here was to get as many settlements built and get as many settlers into the West Bank as possibly could be done before any final agreement would be concluded. So leading up to the Camp David negotiations, you had a continued settlement expansion through the entire Oslo period, with an acceleration of settlement expansion at the end of the Oslo period. Now, when we talk about settlements, we need to be clear that this doesn't mean your friendly Jewish neighbor moving into the house next door. What this means is confiscation of land which the Palestinians had used for farming or for orchards or were planning to expand their villages or cities onto, this land would be confiscated by the Israeli occupation authorities, and then a big housing development, very similar to the type that you see here in Southern California, would be built upon the confiscated land. Then the land or the settlement would be connected to Israel, pre-1967 Israel, by what's known as a bypass road. That is, this is a special road built for use of Israeli citizens only to connect the settlements to the rest of Israel, basically so that people could commute back and forth to jobs and schools and so forth. The settlements also use the water supplies of the nearby Palestinian communities, intended to drain the water aquifers and make it hard for those communities to continue farming and to continue to be viable communities.
Professor Rauch explained that the mindset of the settlers and the economic incentives of the Israeli government have led to further encroachment on Palestinian lands.
The settlers themselves tended to be divided into two groups. There are about a third that are ideological settlers, that is, they see settlement as redeeming the land for Israel, for the Jewish people. And then there are two-thirds of the settlers who are coming for economic reasons. That is, they are responding to incentives provided by the Israeli government in terms of cheap utility hookups, better school facilities, housing subsidies, and so forth. And these economic incentives were estimated by the World Bank to run at about $1 billion a year.
With nearly 250,000 settlers already in place, the Israeli government has created an entrenched voting bloc of citizens. And with each denium of land that is confiscated by settlers, Israel achieves a new bargaining position from which to negotiate the fate of the remaining Palestinian territories. In effect, the settlements make it possible for the Israeli government to say to the world, "We cannot go backward and dismantle our settlements. They are hard facts and must be accepted as such, even as we build more each day." Stationed outside the town of Jayus, Steve Floor of ISM explains the meaning of the wall to Palestinians.
I've been in Jayus for the past about 5 days, and our main responsibility there has been gate watch. And let me give you a little explanation on what gate watch actually is. Jayus is a small town of about 2,800 people. Approximately 75 to 80% are farmers, and now what's happened is the Israeli government has erected a huge barrier known as the Apartheid wall that has severed the Jayus community and separated these farmers from their land. In the process of their colonial expansion, the Israeli government has confiscated the Jayus land, approximately 13,000 dunams, and is now de facto been annexed to Israel. And now the farmers don't have access to their own land that they lived on and relied on for their subsistence for generations and generations. So now about 3 times a day, Israeli troops in jeeps and Hummers come by, and they open the fence to give farmers access from one side to the other side. And the farmers there with the donkeys, their tractors, waiting for these 17 and 18-year-old boys and girls to come by, to give them access to the land that they've owned. And you can't even believe it. You can't even fathom the humiliation that these farmers have to go through on a daily basis. Sometimes we sit there at the gate and we have to wait 2-3 hours for the soldiers to show up. Meanwhile, there's one family with children that have to get to the other side of the fence so the kids go to school. But every day the kids are late because the soldiers don't care. They don't show up on time. It's really miserable, and words can't really describe it. So we were there for about 5 days, talking with families and meeting them and hearing about the suffering. And it is suffering in every way. It's suffering. It's really hard.
Steve explains how the separation wall has affected Palestinians near the city of Qalqilia.
Now we're trying to get into the city called Kalkilia, and to get here it's a trek. It really is a trek. From Jayus we have to take local transportation to a city called Azun, and from Azun we have to transfer to another taxi to the entrance of Kalkilia. Kalkilia is a city that's surrounded on three sides by the Apartheid wall, a huge 20-foot concrete wall with watchtowers and all the security amenities of touchpad sensors, trace pads, motion detectors, and everything. And on the other side, there's a checkpoint that we can't pass because the military will deny us access to the checkpoint. So what we have to do is basically walk all the way around, way out of the way, into the farmland. We're here with a guide right now who's going to try to help us gain access into Kalkilia, but we just observed that there is a tank blockading the entrance to Kalkilia, which is going to make our entry even more difficult. So at this point it's a waiting game. We'll be here for at the minimum of an hour and a half to 2 hours to trying to see if the tank moves, or to see if we could find some more farmers that we can accompany to the gate to be able to gain access. But it's an extremely difficult situation to be at the mercy of these soldiers, to have to wait for the okay to be able to move in and out of a city. You can only imagine. Actually, you can't even imagine. You have to experience it to really understand. And as I begin to, words don't do it justice.
So the wall hems in the Palestinians, cutting them off from their businesses, from their schools, and from their farms on the other side of the wall, thus creating islands of orphaned Palestinian territory. Territory that must be abandoned, only to be absorbed by the next wave of Israeli settlers, who feel justified in confiscating the abandoned islands of land. These are the facts on the ground, a bargaining chip for the Israelis, a curse to the Palestinians.
We're finally here in the city of Kalkilia, and if you look to my back, there's the highly controversial wall that Israel has been building. The Israeli occupation forces have been constructing for approximately a year now. The wall is sometimes referred to as the Apartheid wall, or the isolation wall, or isolation fence, or even isolation cage, as some individuals refer to it here. The construction of the wall itself, it's approximately 25 meters high and constructed of purely steel and concrete. It extends in both directions for a total length of approximately 2 kilometers and effectively surrounds Kalkilia completely, isolating it from surrounding villages and cities, not permitting the residents of Kalkilia to leave and have free access, and it's restricting their freedom of mobility.
Either way, the wall is rising to surround the Palestinians, as an attorney from the town of Kalkilia explains.
I am an attorney in the province of Kalkilia and would like to talk about the dividing apartheid wall that Israel is building since 2002. Israel as a government built this wall to prevent the Palestinians from having their own country. They want us to have cantons only. The apartheid wall affected thousands of Palestinians. The people here are mostly farmers, and they depend on their land to survive. This wall was not built on the demarcation line, but on confiscated Palestinian land. They took also our resources, like 14 artesian wells that belong to the farmers. Israel, by building this wall, is preventing the people from making a living. They surrounded the people and placed them in a large prison called Kalkilia. It has one gate, controlled by them, and allow few people whenever it pleases them to pass. This is a fascist rule as in all Germany, and now practiced by Israel in the 21st century. This wall affected all major daily lives of Palestinians. The Census Bureau stated that the income of people dropped to $80 per month, not enough to pay their electric bill or even feed their children. The intention of Israel to make tens of thousands of people miserable by limiting their movement from their jobs, schools, or worship places. This happens for Christians or Muslims. The daily lives of these people are under the control of Israel. You cannot have peace under these circumstances. Israel is not a peaceful country. It is state-sponsored terrorism. The ugliest form of terrorism is this daily occupation of our land.
بداية من لقمة الخبز وحتى أبسط الهموم.
So what you see in the period about 1980 to 1993 is a slowdown in economic growth in Israel and a kind of corresponding slowdown in economic growth in the Palestinian territories. In 1993, with the Oslo Agreement, you have a divergence between the economic growth of the two areas. So post-Oslo was a boom time for Israel and a depression time for the West Bank and Gaza. And this was not what was anticipated by the Oslo Agreement. The Oslo Agreement anticipated that this would be a boom time for everyone. So this was a big disappointment to people in the territories, and they might have expected a peace dividend much of the type that was seen in Egypt after the Camp David Accords in 1978. So if you look at Egypt's growth compared to the rest of the world, Egypt grew a little bit faster than the rest of the world from the 60s up till 78, Camp David, and a lot faster than the rest of the world post-Camp David. So I think there was a lot of optimism, certainly on the part of World Bank economic officials, for example, that there would be a similar acceleration in economic growth, a similar peace dividend in the West Bank and Gaza, and instead you had an absolute decline in the standards of living there. That is, it wasn't simply that economic growth was less rapid, rather people's incomes went down. The reason people's incomes went down was that post-93 there were closures of the occupied territories so that people couldn't go to work in their jobs in Israel. So the exact mechanism that had brought so much catch-up and economic growth when the occupation began was essentially reversed. And the reason for that was that some people opposed to the Oslo agreements launched terror attacks in Israel, and Israel responded by closing the borders. So then those jobs were cut off, and that was really the main reason for the economic decline post-93, that is, during the Oslo period. One thing that's lacking in this story of economic growth in the Palestinian areas is some notion of an independent engine of growth for the Palestinians, some notion of autonomous economic development. And if one looks into the root causes of this, why the growth of Palestine was so tightly linked to whether jobs were available in Israel or not, the reasons are in part, and perhaps mainly, the policies of the civil administration, that is, the occupying powers of Israel relative to economic development in the territories. So there were deliberate policies adopted, and these were documented by Israeli government studies, deliberate policies adopted to discourage Palestinian industry, especially where that industry might compete with products made in Israel itself. Moreover, there was a system of licenses and permits set up so that it was extremely difficult to establish a business in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip. One had to go to the occupation authorities, perhaps 7 to 10 different offices, in order to get all these different licenses and permits. And whereas in a typical less developed country system, this might have given rise to easy bribery or corruption or evasion, here you had to deal with Israeli authorities who either weren't corruptible, or if they were only corruptible at fees which were much, much higher than one would have had to pay to, say, a corrupt official in Egypt or Jordan. So there was a stifling of independent economic activity by these regulations, economic regulations that were put into place by the Israeli civil administration in the occupied territories. After the Oslo agreements, much of these regulations stayed in place. Insofar as they were lifted, it wasn't as helpful as it could have been, because the Palestinian Authority basically then had to import goods into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip through borders that were completely controlled by Israel. And Israel held up many shipments of needed parts for manufacturing industries because they might be dual use for possibly weapons purposes. So since every inspection could possibly, every shipment, could possibly be held up for inspection, and things were sometimes delayed for months, this made carrying out any sorts of manufacturing activities in the West Bank and Gaza Strip very iffy. And this discouraged investment from the Palestinian diaspora and discouraged economic growth.
The wall is not yet finished, but if and when it is, a turning point in history will be reached. A turning point that does not bode well for an independent Palestinian state.
I think, personally, that the part of the wall that will have the deepest psychological impact for the Palestinians will be the part now being built around East Jerusalem, so that the Palestinians will be cut off from access to East Jerusalem. This will basically mean that their hopes of a state will be dashed, since no Palestinian that I've ever talked to would be willing to accept a Palestinian state that did not have East Jerusalem as its capital. Once that is accomplished, and that could be as early as a year from now, my expectation is that the number of Palestinians who will give up on the idea of a Palestinian state and instead ask for citizenship in Israel will increase. Right now, public opinion polls in the West Bank show that about 25% of Palestinians prefer at this point to give up on the idea of a Palestinian state and to demand citizenship in Israel. My guess is that that 25% will increase sharply after the wall has separated the Palestinians in the West Bank from East Jerusalem, and that ultimately the Palestinian struggle for statehood will change over into an anti-apartheid struggle and a struggle for citizenship. Most likely, that won't really accelerate that process of change from a statehood struggle to an anti-apartheid struggle until after the death of Yasser Arafat, since he's the most potent symbol of Palestinian statehood.